Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to the Adnan Hussein Show, struggle session number 2. We are live. It's great to have you with us, and I have a fantastic panel of guests. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. We have Breht O'Shea from Revolutionary Left Radio returning to the channel. We did a great discussion about Marxian mysticism and spirituality on the left. Breht, great to have you on. Thanks for coming. And we also have Dr. Chella
Yeah, it's always
Ward.
a pleasure.
Great. Chella Ward, professor of classics at the Open University in UK. Thanks for coming, Chella. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, we have Jay from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Thanks for coming.
Honored to be here, Adnan. Thanks for extending the invite, and great to be with these wonderful folks you've assembled here.
Well, it's wonderful, and we had a great discussion about the Crusades. Thank you for having me on. I'm so gratified that you'll be part of this struggle session, because we want to have perspectives from all across different approaches and get really into these issues. And to do that as well, we also have Professor Ambereen Dadabhoy, who is author of Shakespeare between Islam. It's Shakespeare, Islamic World. I've forgotten the title. I've messed this up. It's terrible. But we had a great discussion about your wonderful book. Thank you for coming, Ambereen.
Happy to be here.
Great. Okay, well, without further ado, this last week or two in particular, it's been really, really disturbing to be at what we might think of as the final stages of a medieval siege. As a medieval historian, just witnessing what's happening in Gaza for the past 20 plus months, almost 2 years. It just reminds me of the siege of Acre in the Third Crusade, which was almost 2-year siege. That was brutal. And that's kind of what we're witnessing now. I read a statistic that said 85% of people in Gaza currently are in what is called the 5th stage of malnutrition. It's often irreversible. I mean, that the damage is being done, and that we're on the cusp of genuinely, we've already been witnessing so many newborns, young children succumbing to starvation. You've seen them on your social media, the images that are just absolutely horrific. But we're even at the stage now where within the coming week or 2 weeks, we may be witnessing, mass death from starvation taking place. So, just in the context of this, I'm just wondering about the implications that it just simply is continuing on. And that the world is not prepared to stop it. I saw an incredible sit rep by Justin Poder on his anti-genocide project. And he raised the issue that given this condition and this situation, and he was talking about a tweet from Mira, who's a friend of Guerrilla History. We've had her on as a guest. Who just mentioned that all the people she knows in Gaza, and of course, many of us follow particular people or in contact with people in Gaza, all the people she knows are absolutely starving right now, starving to death. Somebody responded, Kai Stark responded to this tweet by saying that people are so upset and distraught over this that they cannot really imagine how to respond, but that one thing is that it's embittering people to such an extent that they will have incredible feelings of revenge. Just like we're moving from the position of being, as he put it, from rescue to revenge. Like we're being prevented from being able to rescue them. We're being stopped by all these powers. What's going to happen when we start witnessing the real consequences of this policy of starvation and a medieval-like siege on Gaza? And so I just wanted to put that to people, is that, is this changing and transforming politics utterly if you have a situation where the world is not only allowing this to happen, but preventing people from doing something about it. So, I know we all have very strong feelings, about this, but just wondering how people are responding to this. And, what do we think is the emotional tenure of politics going forward as a consequence of really seeing the late stages of not only genocide, but and partly because the genocide resistance has prevented the genocide from being able to completely achieve the extinction of the people of Palestine, that now, by another mechanism, it's being achieved through starvation of people. Breht, I'm wondering if maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. I'll start. Of course, words don't suffice. There is no amount of argumentation or conceptual web to weave that can make this any better than what it is. We are watching the 21st century Holocaust. We're watching it live streamed on our phones. There is a disconnect between what we're seeing in real time and what seems like the rest of the world, or the imperial core, even people in our lives, just going about their daily functions as if they don't even know. So it's this question of, what would you do if you were alive during the Holocaust? Well, we are, and we don't even have the excuse of saying we didn't know about it. And yet there's just a detachment. And I think that is it speaks to some of the worst aspects of human nature. But, this is the real face of the system, and no consequences can ever justify what is happening. But what we are seeing is all of the ideological obscurantist facade of what the Western-led international rules-based order, this is what it really is. It is the culmination of 500 plus years of European colonialism and fascism and imperialism. And that project was always leading here. And so it's hard to even put into words how to feel about it. The one thing that I disdain the most is that the worst people in the world are in charge, and they seem to be not afraid at all of justice or revenge. They have no fear whatsoever when they go back into their mansions at the end of the day that they'll ever be held accountable for this. And if we cannot stop this crime against humanity, at the very least, our next task is to hold these people as accountable as we possibly can by any means necessary. But those are just some opening thoughts.
Who else would like to respond?
Can I add something? Can I add
Go
something
ahead.
to that, Adnan? Because I absolutely, agree with Breht, and of course, absolutely share this articulation of complete horror. I think I would say, that for me, as someone who is nominally a historian, I'm a literary historian rather than a kind of dates of battles type historian. But I would say, not only is this kind of what we expected, but the reason we expected it is because this is actually how European colonialism always behaves. I mean, if we needed more proof, that the Zionist entity was a European colonial project, we don't in fact need more proof that the Zionist entity is a European colonial project. We know, from, for instance, the very simple fact that Theodore Herzl writes to Cecil Rhodes to ask how to go about colonizing, given that Cecil Rhodes, of course, had colonized by that point Zimbabwe, given his name to the British occupation of Rhodesia. So we know this is a European settler colonial project, but the whole idea of starving populations, I mean, France does that to the Algerians, Britain does that to the Irish. And I think the important thing about this kind of colonial technique of starvation, is that the term is almost misleading, right? Because starvation suggests that there aren't trucks with tons and tons of aid, enough to absolutely feed all of the starving Palestinians several times over, waiting at the border, completely not permitted. Just as when Britain was starving the Irish, there was nothing natural about that phenomenon. What was happening was food was being removed, from Ireland. So I think we I almost think starvation is the wrong word, because I think we need to remember that this is absolutely deliberate. And also this is the kind of deliberate horror that actually European colonialism always inflicts. And then just one more thing to add, which is that I absolutely think, or I hope, maybe I should put a little, inshallah, God willing, I hope that when people go through, people around the world have this experience of seeing kind of the scales fall from the eyes of the neoliberal world order, you know, when they see that that this is entirely manufactured genocide, and that the powers that be are not allowing anyone. We've even gone past the stage when they're not doing anything about it, or pretending that they would like to do something about it. That even that is not happening anymore. I saw this horrific video today of a nurse pleading with Egyptian police to allow him, you know, to proceed with one of the convoys, one of the aid convoys that's making its way to Gaza. And he is literally, you know, this relatively young man on his knees, begging, pleading with these Egyptian police, and bringing up things like, for instance, the duty of the Muslim to feed the hungry, and hoping that that is going to gain some kind of purchase with these police who just were sort of stony faced in front of him, with no intention of letting him through. And I wonder whether it might in fact be witnessing scenes like that. And I've thought a lot about witnessing, you know, these last long 18 months, and maybe we'll come back to that. But it's kind of witnessing scenes like that, maybe, inshallah, that really radicalize people, you know, that really make people think perhaps we don't need to bow our knees to those in power in the hope that they will one day serve us. You know, perhaps watching the absolutely distraught nurse, you know, not able to, saying all the right things to those in power, but not able to cross the border and feed the starving babies, which was all that he was wanting to do. Maybe repeatedly watching scenes like that, perhaps, you know, give the lie to this, you know, what is to me a long-standing theatrical project of the West, doing this kind of performance of goodness, of fairness, of international law-based order. Maybe watching those scenes, you know, does something to counter that, so we get to dream of something bigger than simply just the rules working better for more people. I don't know. That's my only hope.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, it's good to be with you all today. And it's funny because I know on some level, Adnan, you want this to be a little bit different from Tankie Therapy in terms of, you know, processing our feelings and trying to make people, you know, feel a little bit better. I mean, Tankie Therapy does a lot of things. I think it's therapeutic for those of us who've participated in it, and obviously also for the listeners. And it's something that I think's been much needed. And I think a lot of that has to do with how psychologically jarring these last couple of years have been for everybody, you know, to a place where, you know, we could always talk about the evils of capitalism and, you know, the way capitalism works as a system, and the exploitation, and, you know, capital coming into the world dripping in blood from head to toe, and you know, really get into this. And obviously, you know, all, you know, Breht, Adnan, you know, we've all been doing this for years now. But I think that one of the things that it connects to what Breht was saying, and actually I think you brought this up, Adnan, about you know, just the revenge kind of impulse thing. And I think, you know, by way of Justin at Anti-Empire Project. And yeah, I mean, I've been feeling that for a long time now, of just like, I didn't used to have such a strong feeling of how much the ruling class needed to pay for what it had done. I kind of had a more transformative outlook of like, look, we can take over this system, you know, we can democratize it in certain ways. Yes, people will need to, you know, be changed, and their ideology, there'll have to be a lot of work to break down, you know, capitalist ideology and all of this stuff. But there was always a little bit of a like, you know, their position within it is kind of structurally determined. And, you know, I don't, I don't, well, I blame them in certain ways. I also understand that they are produced by the system socially, and there's reasons why they believe the things that they do. And that's all true to some extent, but I can't I'm like way past the point of like being able to kind of forgive people in power for what they have allowed to have happen over the last couple of years. And that extends to me to also like, sort of everybody within the Democratic Party, for instance, in the United States, for example, including people who, want to do a kind of left, liberal social democratic thing there. Because I mean, like we just saw the AOC tweet again about opposing Marjorie Taylor Greene's, which was very limited in terms of, yes, it was just trying to take away a little bit of money for the Iron Dome, and it didn't obviously wasn't a full weapons ban or anything like that, right? But like the rationale that she also poses for not supporting this is, oh, like we actually need to fund the Iron Dome. Like it's sort of important to, and continuing to go back, and something she's talked about a lot actually over the years is this role of the Zionist entity in the region as this like stabilizing force that's necessary for whatever, like some magical idea of what she has about the world order could basically right along the idea of what Breht said about the rules-based order being just like, thrown bare in this moment. And, I mean, this is like such an imperialist viewpoint to be putting out there. She could have at least voted alongside this, knowing it's not going to pass anyways, and saying, hey, like, whatever we can do in this moment where people are starving to death, we need to take the stands that we can, and can't even do that, right? And I think that that's like, I don't know, it's just a moment where there's so much of just, I'm just disgusted by like all of these people that have any level of power. And that also extends way down to like mayors and CEOs and, just folks that are just refusing to take any kind of moral or ethical stance around, being fully complicit in genocide. So, yeah.
So thank you, Adnan and everyone. I hope my sound is okay. um, I want to come at this question by way of just yesterday I was cooking dinner for my family, and I was cooking with my mom, and I wanted to follow the recipe. My mom is telling me to do all this innovation, as I was telling her I don't like to mess around with recipes. Anyway, we were at this point in the recipe where something was off, right? It wasn't tasting right. And I was just like, if I have to throw this away, like it's going to be frustrating for all of the work that we have put into this moment, but more frustrating, all I could think about was like the pleasure of cooking with my mom despite our disagreements, the fact that we were making this food together, and the fact that there are 2 million people, less than 2 million people now starving, right? It's changed my relationship to food fundamentally. Like I think about, it's changed my relationship to water, right? Like how the resources that I consume every day without thinking, like I could come into this room and turn on a light and see, does the light work here properly? Should I change it? Is it right? I don't have to think about any of those things because I live in the imperial core, where these kinds of things for the moment are in endless supply, seemingly endless supply, right? And yet, if I had had to throw out that food, I could have done it and started over, which made me feel so awful just thinking about the fact that there are people who are literally in that stage 5 who are dying because Israel is not allowing, and everybody is acting like it's okay. Like it's okay to starve people. Like that is actually allowable under the conditions of war, that there are no rules of war anymore, right? Like Israel has made it so that the rules that the West set up for itself no longer apply. And people think that that's normal. People think, yes, of course you can kill civilians. That's fine in war. It's also fine because of the over 20 years of the war on terror that have conditioned people in the US and in Great Britain and other Western countries to just think, yes, we can drop bombs on people. Many people will die, but at least we'll get that one terrorist, right? That one terrorist life who, we don't even know if that person is a terrorist, but our government is telling us that they're terrorists, so it's fine. So we are willing to sacrifice hundreds of people over there. What gives me hope a little bit as I struggle through all these feelings is people are waking up to the fact that they also might be the ones who their government will be willing to sacrifice. Right? There are loads and loads of people, I think, who are recognizing that they are not as valuable to their politicians as they thought they were. And that's going to be that is a reckoning, to understand that despite the fact that I am a US citizen, despite the fact that I have all of this other privilege, perhaps I'm not as protected. And people need to be aware of that, right? Like, you are not protected. You are only useful right now. And when you cease to be useful, they will do with you what they are willing to do to other people over there, what they're willing to do to the hundreds of thousands of people, the millions of people in this country who are also part of an underclass, that they're willing to randomly arrest, dispossess of their property, treat totally inhumanely. My hope is that people are waking up to it. I kind of see signs about it. The other thing, I absolutely am, I feel the need for revenge deep in my heart. I feel like the only thing that pleases me is that there's no way that Israel is coming back from this, right? There's no way reputationally that the idea that this is the most moral army in the world, the most moral military, like that has been destroyed. Like, they have destroyed it themselves. And the truth about what that country is has also been revealed to people, that you can't hide that, you can't deny it, that you can't sort of justify in any way the reason why anybody needs a religious ethno state. So I feel like that gives me some sort of solace and comfort in this moment. But yeah, I also wonder, I saw this tweet a few days ago, but why aren't there more people trying to break the siege, right? Like, why don't we have more freedom flotillas? Why isn't every person who has a boat trying to go and break the siege? And I also am like, would I do it? Am I willing to get on a boat and face the IDF? Obviously, I'm sitting in my house in California, so I'm not there right now. But I feel like this is what we are being called upon to do at this moment. Like, what would you do if you lived during, as Breht said, during the Nazi Holocaust? Like, what would we do right now during the Israeli Holocaust?
Absolutely, Ambereen. I mean, really interesting remarks and great points. All of you have been raising here about no more red lines and no more taboos. And that's sort of what my question really was about, is like, what are the implications and consequences really going forward for a world that has decisively abandoned any of these kinds of principles? And as you said, there's no going back from it. It's no going back from it in terms of reputational reestablishing of the kind of myth of the Zionist, state as, but in just the same way that was a myth of the, of the Zionist state. It's the sort of the myth of the West is also gone. But the problem here is that they seem quite comfortable with that. The shame and embarrassment that had existed maybe a little bit earlier on, where you could, not right away, right? Not right after October 7th, but after a few months of this genocidal assault on Gaza, there started to be some sense of that you could shame some of the politicians of the West, but they've now inured themselves, it seems, although there are occasionally gestures. There were a few weeks before the attack on Iran, there was mounting pressure where you had somebody, even like Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, or Keir Starmer, Prime Minister in the UK, being willing to make some statement of criticism about the situation and the condition in Gaza. That was immediately cast aside. People were distracted by having a nation state as enemy, of the West, and it was clearly used by Israel to change the discussion and to allow the genocide to continue further, and maybe to get to this point where there might be irreversible deaths as a result of the mass starvation that we're on the cusp of. And just to get to that point, that is, of course, we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, in fact, actually, I would say it's worth people looking at a wonderful essay in a book called Sanctions as War by Manu Kuraku, called Hunger Politics, Sanctions as Siege Warfare. And this is from a few years ago, talking about the sanctions regime, okay, and the way in which the politics of attempting to starve a people, an economy, in order to achieve regime change operations was a new level of cruelty that was as destructive, if not more so, than open warfare. And that's what we're seeing now in Gaza, raised to a new level of an absolute boycott, an absolute siege, cutting off of water, food, medicines, everything for long enough that it's imperiling, the population. So yes, that is definitely, and we've done an episode on it on guerrilla history. I encourage people to go listen to that episode and also the series as a whole. But my question in some ways is, yes, indeed, what are the ways that we should be responding to this? And I really take to heart that point that it feels like we should all be doing rather extreme things at this point. The Freedom Flotilla, and there's another one, the Handala, is trying to break the siege of Gaza, should be entering into waters close by in the Mediterranean fairly soon. We've been watching their progress. There was the attempt to get to the Rafah crossing in Egypt, and I think perhaps that's what, Chella, you were alluding to, were the prevention by the Egyptian authorities of humanitarian aid organized by the free peoples of this world to break the siege, to do something, um, you know, to gain some attention and actually force the world to confront its complicity in this. And they were being prevented from doing it. What happens when you have this occur? And it just reminds me so much of what Malcolm X, talked about in many of his late speeches, the ballad or the bullet, where he also talked about, if you prevent people from achieving freedom and justice, you are only creating the conditions for a much more, violent and dramatic, uncontrollable response. And that's kind of what I think Justin was saying in his sit rep from last night, is that we are moving into a space where the emotional drive of politics is, if they've crossed every taboo, it's a really wide open, unpredictable, and dangerous situation. And it's going to be interesting to see which direction, we should take things. One possibility that I saw that I thought was quite helpful, Dan Kervick on Twitter, I saw him posting about how after World War II, the world pursued the Nazis for several decades to bring them to justice. And he suggested that perhaps we need to start building an institution and funding it and raising money for, to bring these war criminals to justice, to pursue them and to make sure that they never can live in peace without feeling that there might be some accountability for their horrific, disgusting criminal actions. And that's the kind of thing, it seems to me, if we can't go on the Freedom Flotilla, maybe at least we can build some kind of movements and institutions to say we are committed and dedicated to never letting these people get away completely with their crimes, or at least raising the possibility for them that they have to fear some accountability for their actions in the future. But anyway, I'm wondering any other response before we move. I did want to say that one thing that has happened this last week is that the Hague Group, that was formed early in January of this year, in 2025, had an emergency meeting in Bogota on July 16th to talk about taking, quote unquote, concrete measures in order to prevent the further continuation of the genocide. And that's something I did want to talk about, because that was an attempt, in this atmosphere of trying to do something. And maybe we could talk a little bit about whether we think, that's effective, because that's the one difference between now and previous times, is that, there were people who fought Nazism. There were people who fought fascism, and there were states that fought fascism. We're not really in that position right now. So in any case, but before we get to that, I'm just wondering if any other sort of thoughts and reflections on this. Breht, I thought I saw you indicating that you wanted to say something here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first things first is, yes, I mean, individuals and organizations can do stuff, but nothing replaces the power of a state in an international system of states to intervene. And it does make you wax nostalgic for something like a socialist bloc of old, of a Soviet Union who could step in and at least present some sort of opposition here. But the Nazi point is very interesting. If this is a genocide, which it is, this is an ethno-supremacist Holocaust, which it is. And we talked about the need, the wanting of revenge. And I think Jared made a really important point about, we understand people are given their ideologies and incentive systems through the structural realization of these systems. But there is a point where people are, participating in evil and need to be held accountable, as Jared, completely admits and alluded to. And that's exactly the right way to think. What happened to the Nazis? There was Nuremberg trials. People were held accountable, and there were organizations who still to this day, I believe, as long as there's a Nazi that is still breathing, a concentration camp guard, somebody who is, directly tied to that violence, they are still being hunted. They can never live the rest of their life with a moment of peace. They always have to look over their shoulder. And by revenge, we mean something like that. And that we can actually hold these people accountable over the long term. You're not going to run the clock out. It's not going to be 20 years later and everybody's forgotten about it. We will never forget about it. We will never let the world forget about it. And you mentioned Malcolm X. One of his quotes is by any means necessary. And when we're talking about what sort of actions do we support in the here and now, any means necessary. We fully support the armed resistance by the people of Palestine, and we support, at least I support, any action taken whatsoever that directly tries to stop this genocide. Palestine Action is one of those organizations that is taking things up a notch, that is doing direct action against the apparatus of weapon manufacturing that produce the weapons that go on to murder Palestinians. And of course, the Western countries and the UK in particular are cracking down on them as we should expect that they would. But that is real bravery. That is real self-sacrifice. And I know not everybody's in a position to take such extreme action, but certainly we're all in a position to support it and say we are not disavowing any tactic whatsoever to stop literally the 21st century Holocaust. So those are some of my thoughts. But I did want to mention one thing, and I'll pass it on, which is how we feel when we're eating a plate of food. I have 3 children. I look at my 3-year-old child today, and he went to a baptism, and he's all dressed up, and he's perfectly bathed, perfectly healthy, and almost feel guilty about it. Like I get my child to be, well slept and well fed while they're suffering right now, and we get to have these ideas and these thoughts, but ultimately we get in an air-conditioned car and we drive to a nice church and we go through these motions. And of course, we shouldn't feel guilty for that. And the people that should feel guilty are the ones least susceptible to guilt, right? The people that are actually imposing this suffering, they sleep like babies. They don't have a moment of moral dilemma or sadness or a feeling of like, I'm almost like I feel guilty for having the basic necessities of life, right? So it's the people that are least responsible that feel that, but that is our connection to humanity. That we are not separable from this violence, from this criminality. Our children are their children are our children. And when we really feel that in our bones, it hurts like hell, but it's also the necessary prerequisite to doing anything about it and building a world where that never happens again. So those are just some scattered thoughts for sure, but I do think that we have to take seriously this idea that these are the Nazis of our time, not only in Israel, but in the US. And that we have to take names, and our job, if we can't stop it, our job is to never, ever, ever let them forget about it and to continue to pursue justice until, every single one of them that is still breathing air is held to account, truly.
Yeah, can I just come in on that just briefly? Because I think I want to pick up on the PAL action point in just a moment, but I want to just say something about accountability first of all, because I think, and I hope I'm not going to kind of take us back to the kind of pit of despair by saying this, because, you know, I agree with Malcolm X that anger is usually more useful than despair. But I'm thinking about that, you know, the old Chumbawamba song, I think the band are called, the day the Nazi died, and the lyrics go, "We're told that after the war the Nazis vanished without a trace, so why do battalions of fascists still dream of a master race?" Right? And I think that's partly because, as many of our viewers are saying in the chat, that's partly because, you know, not every Nazi was punished. Many of them were in fact rewarded, but also I think it's because accountability for this kind of horror, whether it be the Holocaust or other genocides, you know, caused by European colonialism, such as the genocide of the Palestinians, go much further than individual accountability. I think we really have to ask the question, why do so many people think that it's okay to watch a colonized, besieged, occupied population starve? And I think the answer to that is actually history, or at least the way that we tell the story of history. Because, you know, I'm thinking about other instances in which people starved other people with impunity. That obviously, I live in Britain, so the most famous one is obviously Britain starving the Irish, where about 1 million people, you know, were deliberately starved to death. And no one, well, very few people think of Britain as you know, the greatest or the most important thing Britain ever did was commit that horrific campaign of starvation. I'm even thinking about sort of moments closer to now, you know, the US, for instance, starving 50,000 Iraqis really very recently, in very recent history. And sure, there may have been individual accountability, but what hasn't shifted is the fact that many people around the world still think it's normal for besieged, colonized, you know, occupied populations, racialized populations, especially Muslim populations. You know, I think there is still this idea that there are people who it's okay to starve, actually. And I think, you know, that seems to me to be what we're seeing with the Palestinians, is not just that certain individuals are getting away with it. It's actually that the world, we are living in a world order in which the vast majority of people, you know, don't really care. Because if they did, we would be seeing, you know, all out revolt. We would be seeing, you know, as you mentioned, Adnan, kind of every boat, or Ambereen mentioned it too, every boat that exists, you know, making its way to the coast of Gaza to feed that besieged population. And I think what that means to me, and I hope this isn't too much of a kind of boring academic thing to say, but the big difference between, you know, Britain starving the Irish and the Zionist entity backed by the UK, the US, the EU, the so-called West, starving the Palestinians, the big difference should be that the decolonial turn has happened, right? It should be that we now, every kind of educational institution around the world today will tell you that they've done all this work on decolonization, right? In the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd by the police officer Derek Chauvin, every single you know, institution in the world wanted to be seen to be doing this thing called decolonizing. But yet, you know, if they're all so decolonized, how do we still live in a world where it's okay to starve a colonized population, right? We still live with those categories. So for me, it's also a failure of thought, or a failure of knowledge making, a failure of what I guess we might call epistemology. So a failure of producing ways of thinking in the world that could counter that, what is essentially coloniality, which is that a colonial power, you know, can occupy, can starve, can commit genocide against a colonized power. And you know, that to me, for me, perhaps because I'm an academic, so that's where I'm not a lawyer, so perhaps I see my work being able to more easily make an impact on how people understand the world order, rather than on how we apply international law, for example. But for me, that is work that needs to be done too, is the work of, you know, not just punishing individuals responsible, but also creating, you know, some kind of global citizenry. Citizenry is not quite the right word, because that speaks the language of borders and citizenship that I don't really want to speak. But, you know, producing some kind of global collective that understands that if we live in a world where people can be convinced that it's okay for Palestinians to be starved because they're a colonized population, because they're racialized, because they're also Muslimized, I think, then it's because we don't have ways of thinking beyond coloniality. We are still stuck in those traps where the occupier can simply, destroy the occupied, and that's considered to be normal. So I think when we talk about accountability, we also need a shift in how the vast majority of us understand the world. I think that's also really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I want to go back a little bit to also to this question about like what are individuals and what are organizations doing, and also this, the provocation from Breht to, by way of Malcolm X, Michael X, Malcolm X on, doing whatever by any means necessary, right? And I think that this is just an interesting thing, and probably because I'm in the U.S., that's a lot of what I'm thinking about in relation to it. But I'm also interested in just kind of globally why we don't see more direct action. Why we have, certainly we can point to the work of an organization like Palestine Action and talk about them as an exemplar of what this, one of the ways that this can look, right? um, and there's been these other efforts, certainly Freedom Flotilla, the effort also, as you said, to kind of break the siege through, I think, starting in Tunisia and getting to Egypt and trying to go through the Rafah corridor. There are these efforts, and there are many others. I mean, any of us that's in a local context is aware of people who are organizing, and usually direct action is some kind of component of what they're trying to do. But a lot of it feels, again, to go back to, I can't remember who said this, but somebody talked earlier about kind of like appealing or being reduced to begging. That was the discussion about of that image of the police officer or the border official or whatever in Egypt, and being reduced to the begging position. And I'm not, look, the person who did that and who went there, all those folks are brave as hell, right? And so I'm not saying anything about that individual or that organization's effort that way. But I think that posture of being kind of reduced to a position of begging is something that's not new but it is something I think that we have seen within movements in the imperial core in recent years, of this politics of kind of like the march that is, we calling our protest a march, or calling our march a protest essentially, right? And you know getting out with signs, and it's not really clear who the target of the protest is, right? Like, you're kind of speaking out to the public, you're kind of trying to get people morally onto the side of your issue. And but it's often not clear for people who participate in it or for people who are watching it, like, how does this directly connect? Like, if we're protesting the US's dirty war in Syria, like, what is it about our protests that actually helps people understand who's accountable for it, even beyond the US state? Because obviously the state is one of the responsible parties for sure. But as we see Palestine and all the organizing that's gone on around Palestine for decades, right? The work of BDS, like, to develop these understandings of the level of complicity in the organizations and corporations that are responsible, that fund, that do there's so much good work there. And yet there's like a failure to move that good work of identifying what are all these legitimate targets to people actually taking actions that target those corporations in different ways. I think it also connects into like the labor movement, within the imperial core, and its own ability to kind of, develop into strikes that are willing to transgress legality, go beyond like, okay, Taft-Hartley says we can't do this, or, we got an injunction locally, so we're gonna go back to work, right? And this kind of thing. And so there is this, I think, general issue of people not wanting to break the law, which I think goes against very much, even if you just go back to like the Martin Luther King tradition of civil disobedience and so on. He was all about law breaking, right? And all about, confronting unjust laws. And we don't have that kind of courage on any kind of large scale. The people who do it are brave as hell, and my hats are off to them for sure. But like, so there's that. Then I think the other question that raises, right, is we do tell people to join organizations. We believe in that, right? We believe in people joining organizations, parties, etc., right? To get beyond just what do I do as an individual. But I'm also not seeing, and I think this is not just me saying, I hear this from folks who listen to our show all the time of like, yeah, but what about when the organizations aren't really doing anything to meet the moment? You know, they're analyzing, they're creating political education and so on, all of which is worthwhile, right? It's all valuable, it's all good stuff, but it doesn't meet what's demanded right now when you have a situation where, you know, 2.3 million people could just be evaporated off of the face of the earth. And I think that there's something deep that we all have to interrogate, self-critique, right? Me too, right? About why am I not doing more? What is it about how I've been conditioned that I've accepted, and how do I work with others that we can get past that as well?
So I want to kind of respond to some of the things that folks have been saying. I think in terms of direct action, I do want to shout out to students, the student movement, and students all across this country, certainly my own students at the Claremont colleges where I work. They challenged the rules of the university. They, according to some universities and police departments, broke the law. They were arrested. They put their bodies on the line. If you think about what happened at UCLA, if you think about what happened at Columbia, what happened at UCI, what happened at Pomona College, one of the Claremont colleges where I work, where students were arrested in April. They faced brutal police forces for what they believed in. And I think our students are an example for the rest of us in terms of what are we holding on to? And I think about this all the time, like, what am I holding on to? Oh, I have to pay a mortgage. And so I can't lose my job. And so I really, that's my priority, right? Like what these are the things that this moment is asking us to question. What is your priority to humanity? Versus what is your priority to what capitalism has conditioned you to believe is the important thing. Having my job is important, having my house is important, having these other markers of success. Those measures are the things that are important, rather than putting myself, my body on the line to protect people who have been brutalized, not only for the last 18 months, but also 77 years before that. Right, or 70, 75 years before that. And I think we all do have to. I saw a comment that said that you people in the U.S. are weak, we're soft, we've been conditioned to fear the loss of our comfort. Like that is more fearful than actually speaking out against this genocide. Right? It's not that hard to say. Starving babies is wrong, and yet people still have so much fear in terms of just saying that, because they fear the loss of their friendship, some kind of repercussion at work. And I think we need to help people. I mean, which sounds so awful, right? Like at this point you shouldn't need help to say that, but like, come out of the shadows if you feel this, and say, the more of us that say this, then the more of us can move towards acting too, right? Like I think our students, again, they have been an example for me, at least, to think about, like, what am I willing to lose? People in Palestine are losing their lives. What am I willing to lose here? The other thing, I just want to get back to the point that that Chella was making, and that we've all made in some way or another, but I think is worth stressing, is the fact that the Palestinians are seen and believed by the West to be deserving of this kind of violence, right? And what is this history that has allowed this kind of belief to take hold so that people can't say anything. Like, why do people think that it's okay to wipe out entire lineages of Palestinian families? Why is it okay? Why can they never be the victims of this violence, even though they're experiencing this? Israel is still the victim, right? Jewish Israelis are still being perceived as the victims rather than the people who are actually experiencing genocide. And of course, we can think about the long history of Orientalism that has led us here, but also I think the war on terror has played a great part, especially recently, in solidifying for people in the West, for I think especially non-Muslims in the West, the idea that Muslims always deserve violence and that Muslims can never be victims because somehow inherently we are already prone to violence, right? Whereas somehow Christians and non-Christian people residing in the West who are also non-Muslim, they don't have the same capacity for violence as Muslims do. Yeah, so I think I'll stop my remarks there.
I think speaking of Palestine action, maybe Chella, you can give us some of your thoughts being in the UK, where they have been prescribed as a terror organization. So, the IDF that's busy slaughtering, women and children. You shouldn't really criticize them, but if you try and do something about it, trying to stop it, suddenly then you're a terrorist. And I think it goes back to some of what Ambereen was just saying in reference to your previous sense of that long history. And I just want to, before you do talk about that, to say we are lucky that we have on this stream, in this panel, particularly some historical depth, an ancient world historian, an early modern literary scholar, and a medievalist. So maybe we should be making use of that perspective if we can. But go ahead, Chella.
Yeah, I guess before I say anything about Palestine Action, let me just give everyone the update, which is that I have to be extraordinarily careful what I say because Palestine Action is now a prescribed terrorist organization by the UK government. And so that means that any expression of support with Palestine Action could carry a prison sentence of potentially up to 14 years. So that obviously makes it extraordinarily difficult to have this conversation about Palestine Action. I want to perhaps not so much go into the background to the prescription, because I think actually Ambereen's already brought it up when she talked about the context of the war on terror and the way that the war on terror, essentially hollows out the term terror or terrorism of really any meaning whatsoever and allows it to be kind of invested with whatever meaning kind of best serves those in power and often those in colonial power. And you can see that kind of all around the world at the moment, especially in Europe. You can see it, for instance, in Paris, in France, where it's common currently for primary aged girls going to school in long skirts to be sanctioned under terrorism laws because items of Islamic clothing are banned in schools. So this is not the UK is not the only country where the idea of the war on terror and the related terrorism acts are kind of weaponized against dissent. This is going on in a number of different places, but I think I don't even know where to start. I mean, what's peculiar, I think, to this specific case is that it means that expressions of support for the organization Palestine Action, could also potentially carry this extraordinary prison sentence. So what happens is it functions as an extraordinary kind of limiter on free speech, and that is already happening. There are already kind of tens of people arrested for doing things like holding placards that say things like, and I'm now quoting the placard to be clear, that say things like, "I support Palestine Action," and what has been, I guess, a really, to me, curious and potentially quite hopeful kind of consequence of this is that some extremely unlikely people, at least within the logics and tropes that circulate under the auspices of the war on terror have been stopped. So there's been famously an 83-year-old woman priest who was holding one of these signs, with that line of text. And what's interesting about that, I mean, there's been lots of discussion about this 83-year-old priest in this country, and it has been presented in a way that I think is itself quite Islamophobic, because people have said things like, oh, but is this really what a terrorist looks like? And you kind of think, okay, but if they had arrested a bearded Muslim man for doing something like standing against genocide, that would not have been any better than them arresting an 83-year-old white woman for standing against genocide, right? So I think there is, that we are still, even as we respond to the prescription of Palestine action, still falling into, I think, unfortunately, various kinds of Islamophobic tropes. But one of the things that I do think is happening as those who are arrested, as it becomes more and more egregious to, try to claim that, for instance, standing with a sign is itself an act of terrorism, becomes more and more difficult for that to kind of hold in many people's imaginations. I think what happens is we start to understand something that many, many specialists of Islamophobia, and particularly of the war on terror, have been saying for a very long time, which is that it isn't actually the case that there are sort of good uses of all of this terror legislation, and these are bad uses of it. It's actually that much of this terror legislation is misused all the time, constantly, particularly against Muslims, but against other people too. Just to give you an example, Amnesty International, have been saying for such a long time that the kind of pile of bureaucracy that's known as PREVENT in the UK, that's to say the UK's counter-terror strategy, it's part of a broader strategy that's called CONTEST. The vast majority of reports that are made under the auspices of PREVENT are actually made against 11 to 15-year-olds because they're made in schools. And about 5% of those reports, according to the Amnesty International report, are actually made against children under the age of 10. So, in order to believe that PREVENT is truly doing its job of keeping us safe from those big scary terrorists, you have to believe that 5% of those big scary terrorists around the world are actually children under the age of 10, right? So what happens is something interesting. You stretch the boundaries of sort of believability that those laws are really doing what we're being told they're doing. And the more people that you sort of try to attach that label terrorist to, particularly those who seem, either because of how they're racialized or their age or because of what they're doing as they're prosecuted, who seem to be so disconnected from any idea of violence or terrorism, the more of those people who are sort of publicly caught under this prescription law, I guess the more people will start to doubt the application of the term terrorism to other people too, right? In other types of usage. So in that sense, I think there's perhaps something helpful about this. Although, the bit that I've skipped over in this discussion is all of the ways that I think the restriction of freedom and free speech, and especially direct action, was a kind of deliberate. It wasn't an accident of prescribing Palestine action. I think it was very deliberate, and we are seeing now various kinds of misunderstandings where people, including police officers, believe, for instance, that all direct action is terrorism, which is of course not the case, right? Palestine action and supporting it, that's what prescription means. You can't prescribe all direct action. But what happens is, you create this, what's sometimes called preemptive compliance, right? You create the idea that people will say, and it happened with the phrase from the river to the sea also, right? There was a period of time where there were all these questions about, well, is it anti-Semitic to say the phrase from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? And the result was that people said, well, even if it's not illegal, I'm not going to say it in case somebody thinks that I mean by it, something anti-Semitic. So you get this kind of preemptive compliance. So you actually don't need to prosecute all that many people in order to get compliance from many, many more people. But I think the kind of more ridiculous, some of those prosecutions become, the more people start to kind of see through the edifice of the war on terror, the Terrorism Act, the way that this has actually always been misused against Muslims in particular. And that makes me sort of hopeful in this moment, because I, like Ambereen, think that the dynamics of global Islamophobia are absolutely part of how this genocide against the Palestinians is being legitimated.
Indeed. I mean, I think I've said on other um, shows or on my own show, I can't remember, but just there is no politics in the West that makes any sense right now without understanding Islamophobia. It's like the only thing that gives meaning. I mean, we've been seeing, I don't know if this is something anybody wanted to talk about, but we've been seeing a meltdown of MAGA here in the United, well, I'm not in the United States, thankfully, but in the United States, I am American. Um, as a result of several things, but really what has triggered it is the failure to reveal any of the so-called Epstein files and the list and so on. And this is what the movement has been built on, is accusing elites of being complicit and involved in this sex trafficking kind of ring. Some of it has been absolute conspiracy theory type stuff, yet there is a real disenchantment with elites in this kind of populist right-wing movement, and they have a critique. They may frame it in this sort of way, but disappointment around it has meant that the sort of leaders of MAGA, the managers of MAGA, the profiteers of MAGA, need to kind of somehow respond and maintain this movement. And so what is it that they can do? Is they can immediately turn to Islamophobia, immediately be worried about some potential mayoral candidate in Minneapolis, or the one that we've recently had in the primary in New York, or wherever. It's because they have no project really other than racism. And one of the kind of longue durée forms of racism has been built not just by the global war on terrorism, but the longer history of the way in which, Western history and Western identity, as it has come to be, has framed itself around a kind of crusader spirit, or, Chella would take us even further back. So, this is, I think, something that's very important to recognize. In this context, but I did want to see if we had any other kind of burning issues maybe to take up. And I did mention, of course, also what's happening in the United States, and it's not so different from what happens across the West, I think. So it's worth always paying attention to those things. But I did also just want to, closing this sort of arena of our discussion so far, is to say that that importance of self-criticism, which has come up a few times, of like, why has this been possible, for us to have this genocide continue so long? Obviously, we have failed. We have failed to stop it. Abu Ubaidah, in his most recent, statement just 2 days ago, I think had the most serious and general critique of the world, and in particular the Arab and especially the Muslim world, for a failure of solidarity and a failure of action. And it's something that just tears your heart to see. You can't just be blaming it on the repressive governments that we've already alluded to, like the Egyptian government, that has prevented solidarity actions taking place. But there is something that is happening that is a failure really of humanity. And that's what we're, I think, really staring in the face of, is that all the vocabularies that we have for thinking about politics, about solidarity, we're running up against their limits, and it's very painful to see. But I wanted to turn it over to others who may have had other issues that they wanted to bring in before maybe we can take a few questions that have already come in from patrons of the show. Does anybody have something that they wanted to raise that we haven't touched upon or discussed so far? Breht, go ahead.
Yeah, I just actually want to touch on it. It was a comment in the section, and I think Chella touched on this as well. But kind of what gives you hope, and then the crackdown on PAL action, labeling them terrorism, and the increasing attempts by countries across the West. In the U.S., we saw it with the Trump administration's crackdown on the encampments and using mass deportation to target pro-Palestinian voices here in the U.S. and the U.K., obviously creating PAL action as a terrorist group. And we see it across the West. It's simultaneously disheartening because the powers that be seem so overwhelming. and so in control. But I always like to remind people it is a function of their weakness. Their crackdowns is their desperation. If they could just use ideology to buffer out the contradiction and sedate enough people and use Islamophobia well enough to get at least enough people in the electorate to go along with this horrific crime, they would. The fact that they have to turn to these more and more brutal crackdowns is a sign of their weakness, but it's also a sign of their danger. Because when you corner the capitalist, imperialist, colonialist beast, it does strike out. We see that globally as America declines as an imperial hegemon. It will continue to lash out and be more violent in its expression, and domestically, as the structure of legitimacy cracks, it will become more overtly fascistic. The fascism has always been there, but they like to step back from that and put on the liberal democracy mask when they can. When that's no longer possible, the fascism comes out. The Epstein case example of this, because what it represents as at its core is a distrust in the elite. And, you know, the various details aside, and we can talk about intelligence agencies, the CIA, Mossad, and Trump being on the list or whatever the list even means. But at its core, it is part of this long process of regular people across the spectrum becoming incredibly distrustful and outright hostile to the elite as a whole. And it's filtered through this one case. And it's kind of like the Luigi gave like a full spectrum sort of expression of people's hatred of the health insurance company. Epstein is a full spectrum vehicle that people can express their hatred of the elite, which is part of this breaking down process. Now, what Israel depends on, that depends on the U.S. materially, right? We all know that. If the U.S. pulled all military and economic support of Israel, Israel wouldn't be, long for this world. Israel knows now that it cannot count on the liberal left of the Western world. Institutionally, it still can. The Democrats are still in power, but the base of the Democrats are already shifted hard away from Israel. It's just a matter of time. And figures like Mamdani make them so upset because he represents a refusal to kowtow to Zionist demands, to back down on every single statement, and, kowtow to accusations of anti-Semitism. So now they're being relegated to the right, and they're really losing their shit because they're also losing the American right. That they can't now depend on this neoconservative wing and the Charlie Kirks of the world to prop up, and Jordan Peterson's, right, to prop Douglas Murray's, to prop up Western right-wing support. So now that's even at question here. And now a lot of right-wing anti-Israel sentiment does come with plenty of just overt anti-Semitism. So I'm not condoning that. But what I am saying is that they are losing huge parts of the right. And Marjorie Taylor Greene outflanking AOC on that one bill is indicative of this broader contradiction within the MAGA right, which is ostensibly America first and is having to face the U.S.'s not subservience, but intertwinedness with Israel, right? It's not that the U.S. is subservient to Israel, or even that Israel is subservient to the U.S. It's that ultimately they represent the same power structure in two different places of the world, and they mutually benefit greatly. So ultimately, the last point I wanted to say on this is we talk about Gaza as a training ground for what the elite are going to impose on us as their system continually spirals out of control and no longer serves the majority. And recently, Peter Thiel, one of these freak billionaires, he was doing that interview, and they asked him, "Do you want to see the perpetuation of the human species?" And he paused and he pondered. And what this signifies is this accelerationist tech right that is seeing automation as a potential through which they can completely displace real labor, the working class as such, and then we are no longer useful to them, which I think was brought up earlier. And then what's left when huge portions of the world, and who knows if this will actually come to fruition, if AI will actually do this, but they envision a world in which AI replaces labor and we're no longer necessary at all. And all we represent to them then is opposition, is the possibility of rebellion and revolution. And if they can hegemonize the technologies and use that to submit us, just as Israel is doing in Gaza, then they can continue on becoming the world's first trillionaires as the world burns and the rest of us enter a Blade Runner dystopia. So all of these things are connected, but ultimately I just wanted to highlight that point that the rise of the police state and the rise of fascism is always a deep symptom of the capitalist liberal order's weakness and desperation. So there's positives and negatives with that.
So I want to follow up on that very hopeful end of the world that Breht just gave us. I was in Morocco a few weeks ago, and I was thinking, and that's when I first encountered that Peter Thiel clip. And I was just thinking, here's a man who obviously has been all over the world, seen everything, and yet he's so incapable of envisioning a world where people like him don't get to set the rules for everyone else, right? I'm like here amidst these fields of wheat and hay with shepherds, like people who've probably been like in their family, this job has been done for centuries. And I'm like, do you know what men like Peter Thiel have planned for the rest of us? Right. I just feel like it's so like these conceptions, like these are the people who get to decide what is the future of humanity. It's such a siloed global north vision of what the rest of the world is, and that gave me a little hope. Like, you know, the shepherd doesn't care, I don't care what Peter, I mean, obviously I might be slightly more affected given where I reside, but you know, the world is so much bigger, I think, than what these people imagine for the rest of us, which for me gave me a little hope. But I do want to come back to the terrorism thing that we've been talking about, right? Like terrorism has been defined through Islamophobia, not just in terms of the war on terror, of course it has, but as Adnan has been pointing out for us, and as Chella has also been saying for centuries, right? Like it's not just that the West, the whole idea of the West is created through its interactions with and its managing of Islam in whatever way, shape, or form it has managed to do that. And I find it so interesting that Luigi, who has allegedly killed the CEO, I can't even remember of what he was CEO was of, other than an insurance company, he was charged with terrorism. The guy who killed a state representative, too, like shot one and killed the other, and had a whole list of other Democrats that he was going to go after, he has not been charged with terrorism, even though like the whole point of what he's doing is textbook terrorism, right? So we should absolutely, I mean, obviously Muslims have been ringing the bell in the US for decades about the fact that these terrorism laws are not about terrorism, they're about surveilling and arresting Muslims. But here we have a case of this white man being caught up in this terrorism law because, again, it was about attacking elites, and that is the thing that this culture is the most afraid of. And lastly, I think what I find very interesting, and I haven't worked my mind around this, is again this MAGA, Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk turn towards the criticism that they marshal against Israel on the grounds of America first, and their criticism of Epstein can very easily slide into the kind of disgusting forms of anti-Semitism we've seen from the right in the past, but right now it's quite contained, and I see people kind of cheering on, which of course I would cheer on the cannibalism of MAGA, that's fine, but cheering on the kind of attacks that they're marshaling against Israel as somehow being supportive of Palestine. And I don't think that that's what it is. I can't figure out what the agenda is yet, but I certainly do not see Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk as allies, especially when Turning Point USA's whole mission is to get people like me out of academia.
I think that maybe just as we recognize, as you're saying, Ambereen, and I completely agree with you, just as we need to recognize that the whole, war on terror had a kind of foundation of Islamophobia, I think we also maybe need to think a little bit particularly to better understand why the genocide of the Palestinians has been allowed to go on so long, I think maybe we also need to think about the way that ethno-nationalism has also always been Islamophobic, right? And the way that I think I want to frame that is by thinking about the discourse of origins, and the idea that Muslims are people who come late to the history of the world, a world where things are already settled. And people will recognize this kind of rhetoric from anti-migrant logics also, because many groups of migrants are often kind of positioned as Muslims, even if they're not Muslims. But if you think about the way that that Israel tries to kind of tell the story of history in order to legitimate itself and delegitimize the Palestinians, it often revolves around the idea that because Muslims come late to the history of the world, and by that I mean, Islam comes to the world in 610 CE, so it doesn't have those kinds of ancient origins. And it's precisely those ancient origins, that Israel often emphasizes. You can an example of this would be the very long-running discussion about the Haram al-Sharif, right? That's to say that the complex that contains the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, etc. Various, Groups, Jewish supremacist groups, Zionist groups, including, for instance, the group that's called Temple Mount Faithful, which is the group that run, I think, originally by Gershon Salomon, who was, I think, an anthropologist and also a member of the IOF. This is a group that believe that the complex, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque, should be raised because they believe there to be underneath that complex a kind of originary Jewish temple that should be restored. And if that seems like kind of far-fetched early Zionism, various Israeli officials, including Sitzi Hatopfli, for instance, very recently have said things like that Temple Mount, that's to say the Haram al-Sharif, needs to go back to being a place solely for Jewish prayer, the way that she understood it to have been originally. So there's this idea that Muslims are a perversion of the true original ethnos, right? The true original rightful owners of a land. And we see that repeated everywhere in the world. I've already said it's in anti-migrant logics in the West, but it's not only in the West, right? When Babri Mosque was destroyed, so the destruction of Babri Mosque in the 90s is often thought about as one of the kind of early moments of Hindu supremacist Islamophobia in India. But that case, that legal case, only just finished. I think it was 2019 when we finally got the legal case about the destruction of Babri Mosque. And there were various fascinating things about the case. I could talk for a very long time about it, but I promise I won't, including that the god Rama was a party to the case, because the judgment was eventually that although they didn't agree with the Hindu supremacist destroyers, rioters who had razed the mosque, they did, however, think it right that a Hindu temple be built instead, because of the idea that India's population were kind of rightfully Hindu and Muslims were a late coming aberration. And that's, of course, a story that British colonialism told India. That's a kind of different conversation we could go into. But you see exactly the same thing happening, for instance, in 1929, when French colonial archaeologists show up in Syria, in a city called Tadmor in Syria, which is where what's now known as Palmyra is. And they expect, those ancient ruins of Palmyra to be there, standing colossal in the desert of nothingness. Of course, they're not in a desert of nothingness at all. They are within a mosque. They're within the homes of Muslims, the schools of Muslims, the shops of Muslims. So what do these French colonial archaeologists do? Well, they raise the entire town in order to produce the idea of a kind of ancient European origin. Those ancient people were, of course, not European, but the misconception that the Greeks and the Romans were Europeans, is what makes them so useful for colonial use in that way, because the idea, of course, was to justify that French colonial presence by saying, well, actually, in its original state, this town, Tadmor, was not Muslim at all. So Muslims, because they're perceived as coming late to the history of the world, are also seen as a kind of affront to ethnocentrism, right? Or to ethno-nationalism, because they're perceived as being outside of those things that are defined in the ancient world. That's to say, things like ideas of nation, ideas of ethnicity. These things are of course not really defined in the ancient world, but they are retrojected by modern contemporary projects. And I think it's important. I'm just looking at a comment that Vera made in the chat. Vera says Islamophobia in the West is what we need to be aware of and call out. That's the main issue. I absolutely agree that Islamophobia is perhaps, for me, one of the most important ways of understanding how the genocide of the Palestinians is legitimated. I think it's really important we don't only think about it in the West. Saudi Arabia at the moment is doing an absolutely fascinating job of trying to produce for itself an idea of ancient history. As part of a project that MBS is calling Vision 2030, we are seeing archaeological sites, Nabatean archaeological sites being reopened, people being encouraged to think about an idea of ancient Saudi ethnic identity. There can be, to be clear, no such thing as ancient Saudi identity, because the state of Saudi Arabia is only as old as 1932, just as the so-called state of Israel is only as old as 1948. But what we're seeing is these projects, ethno-nationalist projects, of wanting to find an ancient origin in order to displace Muslimness, in order to delegitimize Muslimness. And if we don't stop that in Palestine, we will see it simply replicate itself around the world. And just to put my point very clearly, and I don't do this kind of only to frighten everyone, but to put this very clearly, the end point of ethno-nationalism is the genocide of Muslims, right? In all of the instantiations where we see ethno-nationalism around the world at the moment, it's particularly Muslims, because Muslims are perceived as coming late to the history of the world and being an affront to ethno-nationalism, that end up being the kind of battle line, against which ethno-nationalism fights for its legitimacy. So, when we talk about Palestine, people will often say things like, oh, well, if they get away with it in Palestine, they'll do it to all of us. I'm never sure how useful that kind of universalizing is. I understand the rhetorical power of it, and I think it's important that we see that we are all part of this system. At the same time, if they get away with it in Palestine, the first thing they will do is do it to Muslims all around the world, because that is already happening. The epistemological basis for that is already being laid, all around the world. So I absolutely think that standing against Islamophobia is one of the most important ways that we can stop or we can stand against not just the genocide of the Palestinians, but the repetition of those genocides in ethno-nationalist regimes around the world.
I had a comment on something else, but that was so good that I almost lost it. But I'll just say, to go back to the discussion about MAGA a little bit. I mean, my reading of that, actually, more than anything, is probably the mirror of what people would say is the role of Bernie as a kind of sheepdog for the Democrats, right? Is an understanding that there is a widespread, I wouldn't say the pro-Palestine movement is deeply popular in the United States in some kind of mass level, of course. But I would say that there is a high degree of disgust with the state of Israel that even permeates, kind of across different registers. And one of the aspects of it too is the stuff that Breht was talking about earlier, and Chella also with Palestine Action. All these attempts to regulate speech and freedom of movement and what you can say, that kind of stuff doesn't really sit well with a lot of people on the right. And I see it as a similar kind of co-opting move by some folks on the right of saying, okay, some of us have to move our position over here. We're not going to be radical pro-Palestinian, Israel. We're going to sort of say, Tucker, I think, is a good example, where he says, look, I like Israel just fine. They're our ally, etc. But shouldn't we have a conversation about how much they're leading our policy and whether we should be providing them this much, military aid and this kind of stuff? And so it's a very limited critique, right? And you see that again with Marjorie Taylor Greene in her critique of it's very limited. And I think it's a way of kind of getting into that same, they have the same sort of critique of some of this as they would about wokeness or something like that, right? Of hey, you're saying we can't say certain things. You're saying that we have to watch what we say and how we act, right? Where so it's more, I think, within that realm. And I'm not even very I don't really believe those actors in terms of how they're approaching it. I think it's really just like, we need some voices that are on this issue so we don't bleed people from our party that are like disaffected with what's going on right now. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, it's always framed in a nationalist context. It's never about caring about imperialism or caring about Palestinians. It's like, well, we shouldn't be giving money to any country. You know, we should keep our money for us, as if they're going to keep it for Americans and then spend it on healthcare, housing, or anything like that. Like, of course not. So yeah, I think it's important to note that. I just really wanted to, sorry to butt in here, but when Chella was talking about feeling kind of uncomfortable sometimes with the line of reasoning that, you know, if they get away with doing it to Palestinians, they'll do it to us. I share that sort of like, I don't know if that's the right way to go about it. As you said, I understand the rhetorical power of it and the sort of placing of Palestine at the center of this global movement for change and desperately needed reform. But it feels kind of narcissistic to be like, well, we should care about it because eventually it could come to us. No, we should care about it because it's happening to human beings, period. And then we can go from there and talk about what the implications might be. But yeah, I don't want to condemn anybody for saying that because I've said it as well and it's rhetorically powerful, but we should think carefully about how we actually phrase it because it's not about us. It's about what's happening right now to the Palestinians, and it should stop on its face for its own reasons.
Well, normally we try and just go to an hour and a half. I'm going to ask for your patience, both audience and panelists, if we might be able to take a few minutes for a couple of other questions that we've had on the agenda, to have your thoughts on those before I ask you about, what you'd like to highlight and how people can follow your work and so forth. But we did have, and I should say at the outset that these are questions from supporters and patrons ahead of time, and we've also tried to engage with those who are in the live audience in the chat and take up some of the comments and questions and queries that you have going during the live stream. But if you can support the show, you can go to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein and keep us going, making all this content. We'd really appreciate it. But we always want to get to as wide a scope and audience as possible to have access to these things. So I do want to put this question forward. There were two questions really that came up. One that kind of relates to something we were discussing a little bit tangentially earlier on. So that might be a good concluding one as we reflect on our way out. But before we get to that, about our sort of status as educators and what we think the value of that is. But before we get to that, I had one from Abram Zivuster, who mentioned that he thinks, and we also had Jacqueline van der Ven also in the chat raise the same kind of issue about why there is very little talk in the pro-Palestine solidarity movement about the systematic rape and torture of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. That when we talk about the sort of rape hoax propaganda that's used to try and bolster support in the West in particular for genocide and legitimate it, by constantly resurfacing the story that has been debunked over and over again, but seems to be very persistent in being covered in the mainstream media whenever Israel is sort of losing the propaganda war. We get either an attack on something like Iran or bombarding some new theater of Israeli expansionist war, or we get the resurfacing of the story about October 7th. Sexual assault, when in fact, actually, there is so much more documentation for the abuse of male and female and Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And so I was wondering why, that's not talked about as much as it should be. Of course, my first response would be, by whom? Of course, the mainstream media doesn't cover it at all. We expect that. But the question is why isn't this as much or as important? in the pro-Palestine solidarity movement. I'm wondering if anybody had any, thoughts or analysis of this. Chella, you looked like you were maybe about ready to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I can maybe start, and then people who are cleverer than me can jump in. But I think that it's really important that we think about how our effective relationship with this genocide is gendered, because I think that Hasbara kind of accounts have been really, really excellent at weaponizing women, and they're not alone in being excellent at weaponizing women. In fact, as we know, the UK and the US have excelled beyond belief at weaponizing women, for instance, in order to invade Iraq. So when you see those kinds of
Or
very
Afghanistan.
or Afghanistan,
at
right?
the start of the global war on terror.
The standard story for for US UK military invasion in the Middle East is there are women that need to be protected from evil Muslims, right? And we're being in some ways prepared for that in Iran at the moment. I think this kind of ratcheting up of a discourse about women's rights, and in what other sphere of the world could you say that the US currently cares about women's rights, apart from in order to use them as justification for invasion? But I think having learned from that script is part of the reason why Israel is so good at showing us these kind of empowered girl boss, very blonde, very beautiful Israeli soldiers, for instance. It's also part of how it desperately wanted to manufacture stories about the rape of women on October the 7th, for instance. And I think it's connected also to ideas about babies in ovens, on all this kind of manufactured stuff. And I think that on the kind of flip side, because the rape of Palestinians in extrajudicial detention happens to men as well as to women, I think that is getting caught in the matrix, which is again Islamophobic. We keep coming back to this, but which presents Palestinian men, Muslim men, as always kind of potential terrorists, right? I think what gets the liberals on side slightly in the question of talking about a free Palestine is when you tell them, half of those murdered by Israel are children, or you say, the vast majority of them are women and children, as if it were not, as if murdering men, civilian men, were not a bad thing. And what that does is play into this kind of tacit notion, although very loud tacit notion, that Palestinian men are always kind of potential terrorists, which is just a straightforward Islamophobic trope. So I think part of the explanation for why don't we talk more about the rape of Palestinian prisoners, I think part of the explanation is they don't fit neatly into those narratives that have been circulated, which is about women, either the Hasbara narratives, which is about women being particularly harmed by Muslim violence, or the sort of liberal narratives that kind of say, oh, but it's mostly women who are being killed, in order not to have to talk about the fact that it's also bad to kill Muslim men. So I think the gendering is really important.
I want to follow up. I think Chella is right in terms of the gendering is really important. There's also a long history in the West. I know we keep saying there's a long history to everything. No, because there is a long history to everything in terms of who is an appropriate victim of sexual violence. Just if you think about in the context of the US, and the reason why I bring up the US is because this is the place where I live that I know the best. So also the history of sexual violence against enslaved people in this country that gets erased. If you think about the founding father Thomas Jefferson, perhaps in his relationship with Sally Hemings, with whom he had children, there could have been no consent in that relationship, and yet the myth of this country continues to treat it as though it is a kind of romance, right? And so the idea that enslaved women could have been sexually assaulted is unfathomable, right? Which also then creates this idea that the only victims of sexual violence can be white women, and the only aggressor can be Black or brown men, right? And so all of this evidence that we have, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen the horrific video of the Palestinian prisoner being assaulted by Israeli prison guards, right? Like, that is a real video that you can watch, and yet it has not been picked up by the Western media, right? It's not talked about by the people in power because they can, in fact, just look away from it. And I mean, I think that in the solidarity circles that I'm in, people talk about it. Like, this is obviously one facet of the apartheid state that prosecutes children, that sexually assaults prisoners, right? All of these things that this state does, we know about it. It is well documented. And we know the fact that in 1948, the people who founded the state of Israel also committed acts of sexual aggression against indigenous Palestinian people in that land. Like, they bragged about it, and they have that on video. So, like, there is a lot of evidence for it. This question is about, like, who is paying attention. People in the movement are paying attention and documenting things. Other people aren't paying attention. And I don't know if it is helpful to speak this as one of the reasons why, but as Chella said, I think people in the West respond to children being harmed, to women being harmed, and obviously they respond the most to white women being harmed than they do to any other kind of woman being harmed.
Yeah, great analysis from both of you on it. The only thing I would add is just sort of small, but it's just like, I just also think we have a lack of language, a lot of us, and a lack of practice in talking about sexual assault where men are the victim of it. You know, it's just something that is not is kind of a taboo topic in the United States in particular, you know, and I think this has to do with also our patriarchal ideas, and you know, and so I'm not putting that onto Palestinians. I'm saying that those of us too who are in the media sphere and all of this, I mean, it's something like Josh Briand, my co-host on Millennials or Killing Capitalism, he's had some good conversations on the audio side about sexual violence where men have been victims over the years with different scholars, and really that's also a big legacy of slavery too that's not discussed a lot. Also, is the amount of sexual violence that Black men were subjected to in slavery, and then, you know, Orasami Burton has a great book, Tip of the Spear, on Attica and on what he calls the Long Attica Revolt. And he has a chapter, which is one of the most difficult chapters I've ever read, which is just about a whole chapter of the violence after the retaking of Attica by the National Guard, and then the you know, the corrections officers, the prison guards, and the amount of sexual violence that took place in the aftermath of that, and all kinds of bodily, you know, violence and things like this. And I think that it's just not something that we've done a good job, you know, on the whole. And so it's not surprising to me that it's something that we would also kind of fail to do a good job discussing in this moment. But I also think that to the point that Ambereen just made, it is something that is, I'm constantly in text, whether it's group texts or whether it's you know, seeing on Twitter or whatever. There are a lot of people who are talking about it, so it is not something that is you know, totally removed from discourse. But I do think there's one last point just quickly. I also think that there is a kind of problem of, you know, of narration too, of this keeps coming up with you know, Al-Aqsa flood, right? Of this fake, you know, the fake news around it, the manufactured narrative basically of this mass rape, which has been proven to be a hoax, right? As you said, Adnan. But like, so talking about something that's real in I think in contrast to something that's actually not real too, it also, in some ways, you get into this weird place of trying to create some kind of equivalency or some kind of contradiction there, which, I'm not against, but I think it's a little bit, you know, I don't know. I think that there's something there too of there's something quite real and very painful with lots of victims of it that we have mass evidence of that is not taken up at all. And I think, part of the real question also is it certainly exposes the human rights organizations and so on, who should be very much, if they're going to put all of this energy into creating these narratives around something that they don't have any actual evidence to support in terms of that mass rape hoax on October 7th. There's things that are videos that are all in all of our feeds, as well as all these contemporaneous explanations from Palestinians who are like, hey, I was in Timan or whatever, it's the prison, and this is what happened to me, this is what they did to me. And yet there's just total radio silence on all of those fronts. And so that just exposes also those institutions for what they are as well.
Yeah. I think also there's so many things you can say about, in pro-Palestine, in terms of talking about the horrors of the genocide. There are so many other things one can say, and that we end up perhaps focusing on those, partly because, as you said, Jay, you don't want to make it just a question of mirroring, from the other side, whether rightly or wrongly, and partly also from the sense that, just from what we've been talking about, the racism is so prevalent that sexual violence against Palestinians may not be compelling for the audience in which we're working, to kind of scandalize about the hypocrisies of complicity for this genocide. But then again, like, everything has not been working on that level. And maybe one other small component of it, of course, is that what we want to talk about, or what we've become much more kind of comfortable talking about, is the resistance. And that's the Palestinian response, is resistance. And of course, often that can be figured in a masculinist sort of way, where, even on the left, we might have shame and, other kinds of ideas about, as you were saying, about the Attica case. Very interesting. I definitely want to go read that, because I think it's pretty illuminating. But I think there's plenty of other things also. So maybe that's part of the explanation. But I really appreciate the question from Abram. I did want to conclude here with a last kind of set of questions, which is to this panel, particularly since we're educators in various ways, whether inside the academy or outside, do a lot of public education. I know on Millennials or Killing Capitalism, you have a lot of study circles. And so one could say you're involved in a project of political education. And so, there was a question from Melissa Sanford. I have two questions for you and your guests for the struggle session. Considering that all this week's guests are educators in their own right, in this time of genocide, in what ways have your perceptions of your institution and or colleagues changed? And what, if anything, have you done to ameliorate, rectify, and or cope? And in the same context, does teaching at universities within the imperial core have the same power that you felt it did when you entered the academy, if it ever had it? I'd love to hear Jared and Brett's thoughts as well on this, specifically the limits and merits of operating within and without the academy. So I don't know if anybody would like to start on that. And maybe, Chella, when you talk about it, maybe you might talk about a wonderful initiative which will transition us towards what I hope is the conclusion of highlighting an initiative. Maybe you could talk about the Society for the Study of the Past.
I could do that. Do you want me to do that now, or does someone else want to
please
start?
go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for this really interesting question. On the question, I guess I'll take the second half first, about the power of the academy and the imperial core, and then the second one. But or the second one and then the first, rather. I think, if anything, it has shown me that there is an enormous amount of power in teaching in the academy and the imperial core, but that power is almost never used for good. What it's used for usually is in support of the status quo. And I think that's why, to answer the first half of your question, my view on my colleagues, and here I don't mean my Open University colleagues. At the Open University, we've been relatively well protected from some of the things that have plagued colleagues at other institutions, not least because, and this is a kind of technical point, but I'm raising it because it's an important one for organizing within institutions. When universities in the UK were made to accept the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which is the one that associates critique of Israel with anti-Semitism in one of its examples. At the Open University, we also adopted the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism, the JDA, it's sometimes called, which specifically exists to distinguish between critique of Israel and anti-Semitism. And that simple fact, it wasn't actually very simple, I think, to get it through. I wasn't at the institution at the time, but I think that lots of colleagues did huge amounts of work. The simple fact of not only having the IHRA definition, which is the situation many, many institutions in the UK are in, because that definition was essentially imposed by the government onto universities. And the fact of having recourse to another definition of anti-Semitism actually means that, the vast majority of things, critiques of the state of Israel that we would otherwise be told are anti-Semitic, we actually aren't told are anti-Semitic because of the JDA. So, I think one of the things I've learned in these last 18 months is that you have to get your ducks in a row. You really need to have all of the protections available to you, and you need to use them, because it's not just academic freedom, but everyone's freedom of speech that depends on us not preemptively complying with rules that exist to stop us from critiquing the Zionist entity. So I say that by way of parenthesis, but actually the colleagues, I guess, the academics I'm most disappointed in are not my own colleagues at the Open University, who are many of them very wonderful, but are actually historians across the board. We have seen, almost no professional associations for the study of history, and I mean now any kind of history, not just the ancient world. We've seen almost none of them even come out to say that genocide is bad. Now, can you imagine for a moment being a group that is supposed to represent historians, aka those people who ought to know better than anyone else how horrific genocide is? We've not seen, even so much as a kind of wet statement that genocide is bad. We saw the American Historical Association voted in the majority to make a statement opposing genocide, but they were opposed by their council. There was a veto of that statement. So what we've seen, I think, I often refer to it as the ruin of history, right? We've seen history, in fact, show itself to be meaningless, in the sense that, I don't think history has any meaning if it can't meaningfully intervene in the politics of the present moment. And what we've seen is, that history hasn't been hasn't been ended by those outside of the discipline. It's actually being threatened most by those in the discipline who claim to be doing something apolitical, and in the process essentially render history completely irrelevant, but also render it disgustingly complicit, with occupation, but also with genocide. So, sorry, Adnan, it's taken me a long time to get around to what you asked me to talk about. In response to the absolute disgusting apathy of the vast majority of historians and organizations for the study of history, a small group of us, notably 2 research groups, Critical Ancient World Studies, which is the one that I am involved with, and a group called Everyday Orientalism, decided that we would come together. We would found a new subject association. It's called the Society for the Study of the Past, which is explicitly dedicated to doing history in solidarity with the occupied and with the oppressed. So it's very much about saying there's no such thing as apolitical history, nor would we wish for there to be such a thing as apolitical history, because then history wouldn't mean anything. So we set it up basically in deliberate opposition with this complete refusal to stand against the genocide of the Palestinians coming from literally everywhere else, that I could see, at least in history. So go follow the society. You can find it on Blue Sky. You can find it on Instagram at Society for the Study of the Past. We have a conference coming up. People are welcome to come.
Terrific. Who else would like to take a crack at this question?
I can go next. So, like Chella, I share the frustration with our societies not responding to the moment, the membership wanting to vote on something, and then a crackdown. I resigned from the MLA, which is the Modern Language Association, which is the professional organization that I belong to, over its position on Palestine. In terms of colleagues, I think what has been the thing that has gotten me through the last 2 years has been finding colleagues who share my positions and my politics, finding Palestine solidarity among things like Faculty for Justice in Palestine, being able to advocate for our students through that group of people. I think it's been very interesting since the election of Trump how people are now concerned about certain freedoms that were not concerned about them before when our students were trying to advocate for Palestine. I think it's also interesting to think about how academic freedom, now we want to talk more about academic freedom, now we want to talk more about freedom of speech, and we should be, and it's really been about me just accepting the fact that some people that I have been, that it's okay to be disillusioned by your colleagues and your institution especially. And I think the other thing that I have realized that the institution is very willing to compromise every single one of its values and to capitulate in order to protect Israel. Right. We saw that with Colombia just this week, adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I don't think that that's going to help Colombia in any way. I'm fearful that other institutions will similarly do that. However, I think that there is a strong groundswell at a lot of places where faculty will resist it if they can, and I hope that they are able to. I think what still excites me about teaching in the Imperial Core are my students, because they continue to be thirsty for the kind of knowledge that I'm going to give them, which it will always be thinking and reading against the grain, and will always be about thinking about the ideology. Like, yeah, I'm a Shakespeare professor, so I teach a very traditional dead white male author who nobody will object to me teaching him, but the way that I teach him will be to bring in all of these other issues. And so that is the thing that continues to give me hope for the work that I do.
And everyone go check out Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds. Okay, I got the title correct this time. And we had a great conversation about the book. So read the book and check out the earlier episode. I wanted to come in just quickly here before I turn it over to people who I think are doing great work educationally. And that is that I did talk a little bit about this recently on Resistance is Fertile podcast about my disillusion with my colleagues, my institution. And I never had like high hopes for them, but you do always have a minimal kind of requirement that people recognize a genocide is happening and say, oh, that's not a great thing. Maybe we should do something about it, or at least say that we don't think it's a great thing. I mean, that's minimal. So to be just so disappointed by so many people on that level, it has just encouraged me even more to put less effort and interest in trying to reform my institution, to carve out some space to operate within, the imperial neoliberal academy, and instead actually put effort in things like, hopefully, this conference, like the Society for the Study of the Past, and also conversations like we're having right now. I'd much rather invest in bringing on dissident thinkers, my colleagues as academics who find no space in their institutions anymore to really educate people, and people doing this outside the academy and trying to do this in a public sort of way. And that's the reason for this channel is, I used to do a podcast that was associated with my university related to the Middle East Islamic world called The Majlis. And, when we were prevented from being able to record Francesca Albanese's talk last October, because the university administration threatened to shut it down if I recorded it and used it for my students, for the public, as part of a university-sponsored podcast. I said, well, that's it. It's time to put effort and energy into genuine political education and to try and have sessions like this that are also calls to action. We want to analyze the world. We may not feel better at the end of this in terms of our analysis of the state of this world, but we might be pushed towards action, have ideas for one another. And that's actually the best recipe for despair, is actually working collectively to try and change things. And two people who are doing a whole lot of that education are my other two panelists. So Breht and Jay, wondering what else you might be thinking about in terms of envisioning what's the place of doing this kind of public outreach and education on your channels. How do you imagine this in a time of genocide in the imperial core? Of course, you might have a global audience, but we're working in English, so most of our audience are somewhere across the West in the Anglophone world. So how do you think about that, about Melissa's important question?
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief here. But yeah, I've always operated completely outside of academia and institutions. I have a bachelor's degree from a state school in philosophy, and I've never had any illusions that academic philosophy departments were going to be sites of struggle on this front. But my education has come in the community through organizing, through independent media, and then also as a father, right, and as a figure in my family that my nieces and nephews look up to, and many of them are teenagers looking to understand this world. And so I take that incredibly seriously. And what I want to convey to people is that we can all be educators, right? I mean, there are obviously the wonderful professors like the three here that are doing that inside of academia and outside of academia, using their credentialed expertise in service of liberation. There are people like Jared and I who do it at the more community organizing or independent media level, and we're all sort of integrated in that. But you listening, right? You are educating yourself by listening to conversations like this and reading books and learning all this stuff about the world that you're learning, so that you can influence and educate people in your own life, right? Your friends, your family, your coworkers. Not everybody has to have a YouTube channel or a podcast. It's great if you can make it happen, but we're all educators. And every socialist, every anti-imperialist, every anti-colonialist has a responsibility to first educate themselves so that they can go out into the world and educate people in their sphere of influence, whether that's your community organization, your family, your friends, whatever that may be. So I really like to break down those boundaries and encourage people out there to do that. One thing that I am doing recently is I'm getting in, for the first time in my life, into labor organizing. And so I'm actually going to be this year beginning a process of learning how to do political education in a context that probably is like academia, in that it's frustrating, in that it has its own hangups, that it has its own level of comfort, aspects of the labor aristocracy, and how I can tie, a narrow-minded trade unionist consciousness to a broader international proletarian struggle. So that is like a next phase of my educational challenge that I'm going to try my best, without being rosy-eyed or romantic about, what it's going to be like, try my best to educate in. So yeah, we're all educators. Everybody has a responsibility to do that. And there's a reason that after socialist revolutions, the first thing that happens is you raise the literacy level, to 99%, because that is the way that you uplift people's consciousness and dignity and give them the tools to turn around and educate themselves. So.
Well, tremendously well said, Breht. And I just want to say, I mean, you and Adnan and, many others have been like so important to my own education as well. And so just appreciate the work that you continue to do. Yeah, so I mean, I guess for me, the thing I would talk about more, people know the podcast work, and that's great. It's great to I mean, as I'm sure the other scholars here can attest, it's really nice to be able to have conversations within a podcast realm versus like, having to fit within, what your approved course is, or, what somebody wants you to teach, or helping people with graduation requirements, or all of these ways that the academy, as Fred Moten says, like the academy has always been about the regulation of knowledge, not the like proliferation of it, right? And I think that, so it's great to be able to talk to radical scholars, on the podcast, and do that kind of thing. The study groups are probably the thing that's been most meaningful for me over the years related to millennials, and that's, we have one coming up with Sophia Bukhari. Unfortunately, for folks who are not signed up, it is already full. We're at our capacity for our Zoom license, but basically, um it's great. We read books. We've done Cabral, we've done Fanon, we've done, um you know I don't even know, we've been doing them for like 8 years or so at this point. And so it's always really great, and you meet people who are both like, we have people who are organizers that aren't necessarily at all associated with, the academy. We also have people who are professors that usually come through, people who are grad students, people who are, undergraduate students. And I mean, it's like giving up a night a week. And so, usually you start with like 100 people and it whittles down. But a lot of times we finish with like we just did Samir Amin, Accumulation on the World Scale, both volumes. And it took us a long time, but there was like probably 30 of us at the last session of it, and that's like 700 pages of like dense third world economics. So it was pretty, that one in some ways was like the biggest accomplishment in some ways, because it's like if we can all sit, and even though we're all, and part of the thing about the study group is like part of it is like there's aspects sometimes where you're reading something like nobody really knows what's going on in the text, right? But there's like 30 of us, and so we're all trying to like figure it out together, and we're teaching each other. And so it's not so much a thing where, I see myself even as the educator in that sphere. It's just sort of, there's people around me that are interested in a lot of the same stuff that I am, and we all come together, and there's a shared knowledge that comes together, and we can kind of figure it out together. It's like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. And I think also through the aspect of it, like one of the things I like is that we rotate facilitators and note takers. So everybody who participates in it, like develops a little bit of their own skill, where then they can go run a study group in their own community, right? And do it offline. And I think that's more and more, I think we need to be doing more and more stuff out of the internet. I think that is part of what also contributes to the thing I referenced earlier about like, why are people acting less? I think we're more online than we ever have been, and that we have often kind of confused ourselves, or allowed ourselves to be confused into thinking that like tweeting and doing Instagram stories and doing this stuff is actually some form of meaningful activism. And I don't want to diminish it to make it sound like it's nothing, because it's not. Like if we can help people in Gaza get some food that they're able to feed themselves by raising their GoFundMe or their Chuffed or whatever, like that is something. But it is not, it's not allowing us also to, if we spend all of our time there, then there's so much other really important stuff on the ground that we're not able to do. And I think that's part of the problem too, that I'm conscious of, like trying to figure out how do we get past.
I'm so glad you said that, because I definitely feel like, our interminably online kind of lives, confuse people into thinking that, their tweets and so on are activism. They're not. They're part of showing your particular orientation, support, as you said, uplifting certain kind of efforts and initiatives, a mutual aid and support in various ways. It's part of political education, but that's preparation for action. And of course, the best way to be politically educated is to engage in action and learn from those experiences of organizing. So when Breht talks about getting involved in labor organizing, and it's going to have its frustrations and its challenges, any of us who've organized protests or things like that, or campaigns, it is slow, difficult work. But if we kind of connect with one another, and the purpose of having something like this is building some sense of community. It's why I want the interaction with people in the chat, have questions, start putting people into connection with one another so that they go into their communities, they get some ideas, and then be active, in their own world and communities. So let's hope that we take those words, Jay, that critique to heart. It's valuable to have these. I did want to highlight the Samir project. We did so last struggle session, and I just want to say at this particular time, this is a project that I want to encourage you all to support. Of course, you see lots of individuals seeking assistance. Support all of those. Retweet when you get those and try and make a donation. But if you want a project that's organized and doing important solidarity and aid work to help the heroic people of Palestine, of Gaza, in their resistance against the Zionist imperialist forces, this is one way you can help them. I also just want to say, by way of conclusion, that we need some sustenance at a kind of emotional and spiritual level. This isn't exactly tankie therapy. I know that's been very therapeutic for people. But I also am starting a series with a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Mark Applebaum, who's a phenomenological psychologist who's interested and very educated on, for years, decades, in Sufism, the mystical orientation and spiritual orientation of Islam. And, we're starting a series on the names of God, as a resource for anybody. And we don't mean it to be only for Muslims, though I hope Muslims will find it interesting and engaging and a different perspective on their own devotional tradition, kind of Muslim liberation theology. But for anybody who's seeking some sense of how do you survive in this time and renew your inner commitment and life to continue this struggle, because this is a long-term struggle that we're in. And if that can be a help to you, I invite you to listen to those as well. They're coming up on the channel. How can people get in touch with you and follow your work? I'm going to put us all on the screen. I should have done this a long time ago. Jay, let's start reverse order with you.
Sure. Yeah. Most social media, maybe all, it's at MAK Capitalism, like all one word, Mac Capitalism. And then we're on YouTube also at that handle, but you can also just search Millennials or Killing Capitalism and it'll come up on YouTube. And then it's on, we do different stuff on audio and video. So our audio stuff is also available on all of the podcast platforms that people can search or whatever. But and then my personal Twitter is at JAYBEWARE, JB Ware at Twitter. Yeah.
Great. Breht?
Yeah, you can find everything I do at RevLeftRadio.com. That's both Revolutionary Left Radio as well as Red Menace. Thank you to Ribbon Stage, Melissa, Joshua in the chat who've said very kind words about our shows. And yeah, you can pretty much find everything there, and whatever socials are connected through RevLeftRadio.com.
Ambereen, how can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Dadabhoy, and you can Google search for me, and you can find my email that way if you want to send me an email. I also have a website with my first name and last name, and now I'm also on TikTok posting my random thoughts. So it's also, everything is always at Dr. Dadabhoy.
Super. Chella.
So you can find me personally almost on all the socials. I'm at Luxmea, so at LUXMEA. It changes a bit depending on which app you're using. So on Instagram, I'm Luxmea Gram. On TikTok, I'm Luxmea Talk. Twitter, Blue Sky. If you just put in LUXMEA, you'll find me on most of the socials. You should also, as I mentioned, check out the Society for the Study of the Past, either on Instagram or on Blue Sky. I'm also one of the co-hosts of a post-Orientalist podcast on Muslimness called Radio Reorient. You can check that out either on New Books Network or pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. That's part of a kind of bigger project, the Reorient kind of, well, it's not called the Reorient Universe. I'm going to call it that just for now, which also has an academic journal. It also has a blog. It also organizes conferences, various kinds of summer school. So if you check out, you can find them on socials. I think they're at CMS Reorient on Twitter. I think something similar on Blue Sky, and you can find them at CMS Reorient on Instagram as well. But Radio Reorient is the podcast to check out if you want to find me.
Outstanding. Everybody check those things out. We'll be putting links in the description. So if you didn't write it down now, you'll still be able to go back and find it, as well as the Samir project, a link to that. And so I just want to thank everybody for coming and for being patient and staying with us for a really longer than I typically want us. I didn't want to tax your patience, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you did too and found it useful and interesting. You can find me on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. But keep listening, share, like, subscribe to the channel, share this video. And until next time, we'll be having these struggle sessions periodically. In 2 or 3 weeks at most, we'll have struggle session 3. So keep tuning in, stay engaged, take action in your own communities. I wish you all peace and solidarity until the next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.